Hello, hello. We find ourselves in the room today. It's been snowing about 30 centimeters outside, but that's not the absolute reason as to why we find ourselves here. Today is a day of gentle reminiscence and gentle gratitude, for the car has been sold and it finds its way with a new owner. So we're going to say bye-bye and thank you, car. Today for discussion, the posthumous memoirs of Cubas by Machado de Assis. Now, Machado de Assis, this is a Brazilian writer. He wrote for the most of the middle and late part of the 19th century. He finds himself mostly, from what I understand, pinned as within realism, literary realism. However, he has many intricacies as well. And this novel, which isn't incredibly long, while it is a realism novel, it does have elements of the supernatural and the strange. Now, de Assis is actually, I was not aware of Machado de Assis, even though he is a titan in South American literature. He's regarded as Brazil's greatest writer. And he doesn't get as much attention in the West, it seems, compared to Russian writers, French writers, even German writers. And even when it comes to Latin American writers, we all hear about Borges, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. However, Machado de Assis, I wasn't as familiar with his work. And this is the first book that I've read from him, and I didn't know much about it going into it. Now, the posthumous memoirs of Cubas is also translated sometimes in the title as Epitaph for a Small Winner. And it follows the life of Cubas, who, from the get-go at the start of the novel, declares that he is not a dead writer, but rather he is a dead man who has become a writer in death. And there's something funny and interesting about this, that it's at this point that he becomes a writer, even though there are points in the novel where he's actually writing. He's describing his writings. And it's I'll come back to why that's interesting. So it follows the life of Cubas. And the first about 20 pages concern his death and his funeral. And there's an absolute amazing passage as it relates to death and nature, this personification of nature, demonstrating to Cubas in his delirium right before he dies, showing him the passages of time and how time has progressed from biblical periods which Cubas could identify and comprehend, but as it progresses to a sort of oblivion in which things become far too chaotic and incomprehensible to him when he looks into the future, which I think is quite telling of us, in that reality is a bit too chaotic for us. We might not be aware of it, but even in the present, there are a lot of intricacies and strange aspects of reality that we don't understand. And to peer into the future might add even more of that incomprehension and chaos. But I digress in this point. The novel is structured very interestingly in that there are 160 chapters Yeah, I said that right, 160 chapters. But wait, you said this is a short novel. Yeah, almost each chapter is about 1 or 2 pages. They're quite short. There are a few longer ones, but the longest chapters are about 8 pages long. Most of them are 1 or 2 pages. A few of them are even half a page, just a sentence or so. And I think that the Assis is kind of, this creates an erratic and scattered narrative that goes a bit all over the place. There are clusters of chapters that relate quite well to each other and progress a certain narrative or event, but very often there will be a jumble of chaotic chapters in which Cubas will just philosophize on things such as noses, things such as legs. And it comes back to the point of this being a pretty inane story in many ways, in that the life of Cubas is not actually that interesting. There isn't really too much incredibly interesting that happens in his life. It's a pretty it's a pretty typical life in many ways, but in many ways it's a failure of a life. It's failure after failure that Cubas engages with. At the start of his life, he seems to be at a high point. He's a bit of a devilish child. He's a bit of a troublemaker. He doesn't take himself too seriously at school, but it seems the way he writes his memoirs, he seems to describe that everyone loved him. So there is an aspect of potential narrative bias in this. But most of the novel concerns an affair that Cubas is having with Virgilia, a woman who ended up marrying a very ambitious, politically driven nobleman. And Cubas has been in throughout the early parts of the novel, he's sort of courting women. He's trying to figure out where he lies in romance, how to seduce women, and all of that. For the most part, there's a lot of romance and a man trying to navigate his desires, his passions. But he sort of hones in on Virgilia. And he developed this relationship before she got married, and it kind of progresses into an affair. Meanwhile, everyone around Cubas, as he's getting older and older, are telling him he ought to marry. They're proposing people for him to marry, and he's kind of unsure about it as much because his head is completely turned to Virgilia for the most part. So while this is a realist novel in the sense that he's describing pretty mundane things that are happening, such as Cubas having disputes with his family in regards to money and inheritance. He's a bit of a miserly figure, even though it's very well done by de Assis, because de Assis doesn't write Cubas doesn't explicitly ever say that he's a miser. In fact, he seems to exalt that he's quite generous with money, and he's very generous with people. But it's quite clear that he's a bit of a miserly fellow, and he also doesn't know how to manage money quite well. He spends money very oddly and strangely, but at the same time he tries to hog and hoard it and tries to beat other people out of money. So it's very well done. There's a lot of irony, and it's not just irony that Cubas expresses towards, perhaps irony or satire that he expresses towards imperial Brazil at the time, but there's another subtext of irony in regards to, we're aware that this narration itself is not exactly true and honest, and we can kind of get our own picture of Cubas through his narration. And he, for the most part, is he's not a really, you wouldn't say he's an upstanding person. He's not incredibly honorable as a person. He's he can be he's a bit of a jerk. He can be very detached, very cold, but at the same time very passionate, a bit prone to melancholy, but also prone to shunning his feelings. There's a part where Virgilia gets pregnant. So obviously this whole thing's always spoilers and everything. There's a part where Virgilia gets pregnant, and it's quite certain that Cubas is the father, and Cubas is quite excited and quite happy for a time. But then there's a chapter that follows right after that, in which it's declared in a very subtle, brief, detached way that the baby actually miscarried and the embryo is no more. So there's a, it's not he's not prone to too much melodrama, but he's a bit of a neurotic, erratic figure. So the fact that it is a realist novel and it's describing these mundane events doesn't change the fact that there are strange supernatural elements that are imposed into it. Obviously being that this is being written by a dead man. So de Assis is Cubas is a dead man, and he's writing this story. And he's writing this story as if it probably won't be read by too many people, but at the same time he is writing in a way that's sort of with a lot of pomp and showiness to try and show off to the reader. And he references the reader very often. He's like, I know that you may perhaps not be as educated, but for the few of you that are educated in this, and then he'll go on a tangent and write about some sort of philosophical ponderings. He engages with a lot of that. It can be quite humorous. A lot of the philosophy is some of it is interesting, but some of it is a bit of junk, and I think that may be done on purpose to demonstrate Cubas's character. Cubas gets involved with a philosopher who is quite an interesting character, but he's meant to sort of parody the ridiculousness of 19th century philosophy at times, the sort of verbose, not as verbose, but also a sort of philosophy that legitimizes a sense of capitalism, a sense of taking things. Social Darwinism in many ways is a philosophy that is espoused here, not by de Assis necessarily, but that Cubas gets subtly influenced by. Now the funny thing and the tragic thing about this story, and this is a pessimistic story for the most part, while there's a lot of humor, the whole sheen of this novel is pessimistic, in that Cubas is failing and failing throughout his life. He gets lucky, don't get me wrong, he gets lucky sometimes, some good things happen to him, but ultimately life just becomes one failure after another for him. And he's constantly grasping at chances for meaning and to be relevant in his life. And for the most part of the novel, he projects this meaning onto love and relationships. But this love and relationship, there's a tension between him and Virgilia, because Virgilia wants an ambitious man, while she loves the attention that she gets from Cubas, and she loves his personality in many ways. He's not a very ambitious man if all his eyes are just on her, and he's not looking to further his career. So then Cubas at one point tries to develop a career, but this is only really after Virgilia and him looks like it won't be anything that will happen. He tries to further his career, but it doesn't really happen too well. He gets a bit stiff-armed. Then he tries to write an opposition journal, against the parliament at the time, and he gets ostracized by his family and other people for trying to rile up a bit of dissent and to be a bit of a rabble rouser. Then many of his romantic endeavors fail tragically. And then right before he dies, and this is expressed in the first few pages, he has this idea for this amazing invention, which is the Cubas plaster. And he describes it in a way as something that would only rival, I'm misquoting here, but it basically would only rival the exploits of a Napoleon or an Alexander the Great. It was such an amazing invention that he would have been codified as a great man. It was supposed to be this plaster that would cure all ailments. But because the idea was so immense, so profound, so civilizational, altering, he ended up dying because of this idea, which obviously is the most ridiculous thing, one of the most ridiculous thing I've read, especially for this period. Very hilarious. So it's just this story of this man who's trying to grasp at anything, which is why, to go back to this, the fact that the point that I mentioned earlier in this video, the fact that he is a dead man now writing, does show that he is searching for a sense of meaning, legitimacy, and recognition in this world. Unfortunately, Cubas cannot escape the fact that he needs recognition. He needs to be recognized. I think that that's a theme that's throughout this story. He needs not only meaning, but to be recognized. And as a writer, he wants to tell his story. He feels like this is his last ditch attempt. Even as a dead man, he's going to write a story in order to be recognized, to leave an imprint in the world. However, oblivion and the passage of death, which are expressed, these themes, quite beautifully in the novel, they constantly prop up as well, in that no matter what we do as humans, we're just going to be forgotten in some ways. I can't remember if there's a quote. I think there's a quote in this book, but it may be a quote from another text, because De Assis does reference quite a lot of other older texts, and it might be of good use to have a version of this text that has annotations. But sometimes we get to the age where people forget our parents. People forget who our parents were when we get to an old age. And that's a very chilling idea, that the people that were most important to our lives, our parents, have been forgotten already by the time we're still alive. And Cubas as a character is sort of reaching to just be memorable in the story of this grand civilization in life. But anyways, beautiful, really beautiful book. Highly recommend it. The short chapters create this chaotic, scattered feeling, but it's not very difficult to read. It's about 300 pages. Highly recommend it. Thanks for watching. Take care.